How's it going, y'all? My fellow pickleball techs. You're with Rafa, the pickleball tech dude, and welcome to episode 2 of Pickleball Mythbusters, the series where I dive into the most commonly accepted but rarely tested theories and assumptions about our beautiful game. In episode 1, we dove into putting different kinds of paddles in freezers, which it's rumored that pros on tour may do, and whether or not that causes paddles to break in faster. So if you missed that, I'll link that up above. Now this week, we're also discussing break-in, but in a slightly different way. Carbon was the first company to at least come to market with what we now call Gen 4 paddles, meaning paddles with fully foam cores. One of the issues that I run into as a reviewer, in particular with Gen 3 paddles, which is very wildly popular tech right now, is the fact that break-in can not only take a very long time to occur with certain paddles, but it also can have a very significant impact on that paddle's performance. Now, I play with every paddle I review for weeks and hours, so if there is a break-in period, 99% of the time I'm able to catch that and let you know what that feels like. But with the arrival of this Gen 4 tech in the True Foam Genesis, also came the arrival of the idea that the paddles will not break in if they have full foam cores. And after testing all of the True Foams, myself as well as many other reviewers made it clear in our reviews that we didn't experience anything significant in terms of break-in or difference in playability despite how long we played with those paddles. But now that we're a couple of months out from that release, something just didn't quite sit right with me. I lent out my True Foams as demos to a nearby facility, and when it came back, the paddle sounded significantly different and felt significantly different during play. Furthermore, if you listen to what a True Foam paddle sounds like when you first play with it versus what it sounds like when pros are playing with them on the tour, they also sound significantly different. So keeping that in mind, and of course with the arrival of new Gen 4 paddles since the True Foam and many more in the pipeline, I had a very simple question to answer. Do Gen 4 paddles actually not break in? My new working theory before going into the experiment was that I played with these paddles to the extent that I typically experience break-in on a Gen 3 and on occasion Gen 2 paddle. However, Gen 4 paddles are significantly more durable, perhaps 3 to 4 times more durable than polypropylene-based Gen 2 and 3 paddles. Therefore, I would have perhaps had to play with the paddle 2 or 3 or 4 times longer in order to understand if there was break-in on those paddles. But with all that said, it's time to get into the experiment, and step 1 was deciding which paddles to use. Now, of course, the first paddle was going to be a True Foam Genesis, but which shape I chose and how that influenced the other paddles I chose was a slightly interesting route. Now, a big part of my motivation for doing this video now is that the Diadem Blue cores are set to release in a couple of weeks. At this point in time, only certain models have made it to me, which included the 19mm Max, which is their wide body shape. Now, we can technically debate whether or not the 19mm will be Gen 4s because they are technically tri-core designed with a layer of aramid in between two foam layers. Despite that, I think that the 19mm are going to be the best available performing thicknesses when those paddles release. So, keeping that bottleneck in mind, the fact that I only had a Max told me all I needed to know when choosing my other paddles. So in order to keep things most consistent, I decided to stick with all wide body / standard shape paddles and the thickest variants possible. So that led me to the True Foam Genesis 2, as well as a SELKIRK 008 Maxima 16mm, and finally a newer competitor that will be coming out within the next couple of months, the enhanced Gen 4.5 wide body. Slight side note, what you're seeing here on the enhanced Gen 4.5 is not the final painted on design, but I've confirmed that everything with the production model will be exactly the same, except for that design and a slight change in grit level. Now with the paddles chosen, I really wanted to narrow in on what specific paddle characteristics change with break-in so that I could measure those over time. Obviously, the dimensions of the paddle, the measurable weights, whether it's static, swing, or twist, Things like the core makeup, the face layup are all things that never change. So what it really boils down to, and why break-in is so important, is because it impacts ball feel and it impacts power the most. Paddles that are broken in most notably tend to feel more plush and with wider sweet spots, as well as generally hitting the ball harder. All right, and since we know now that we'll be narrowing in on those two paddle characteristics, step 3 was just reminding myself of my initial impressions of all of these paddles. Starting with the True Foam 2, in terms of ball feel, one of the main things that drove a lot of players away from this paddle is that it's very good at ball vibration dampening, making it difficult to tell between how hard you've hit certain shots. But what brought an equal number of players to the paddle was that what you could feel was very nice premium plushness, one of the plusher paddles I've definitely hit this year. And of course, it had the largest sweet spot of the entire True Foam lineup. And in terms of power and pop, this was a low pop to high power ratio. Not a very poppy paddle by any means, but in terms of power, really could hold its own as you approached the upper echelon. It leaned somewhere towards where the 14.3 millimeter Paddletech Bantams were. If you want to see my full review of the entire True Foam Genesis lineup, I'll link that right here. Now we're talking the Diadem Blue Core 19mm Max, which, just to remind you, Max is the name that they've chosen for their wide body variant. You're going to start to notice a theme here with these Gen 4s, but once again, this paddle felt extremely plush. It is probably the plushest out of all the paddles that we're going to talk about today, and coincidentally, also probably has the widest sweet spot. It also felt slightly easier to judge your ball velocity than a True Foam, but still overall a very muted experience. Now talking power and pop once again, this paddle does not have much of a story to tell here because both of those statistics measured for me in the lowest quartile. So this is definitely a very control-oriented paddle that is focused on ball placement as opposed to power. Moving on to paddle 3, the SELKIRK 008 16mm Maxima. This paddle quickly became one of my favorite control paddles that I've hit this year, purely because of how the ball feels off the face. You're getting a sweet spot size that feels like the entire face, very similar to the 19mm Max Blue Core. What you're not quite getting is the same level of plushness as the aforementioned two paddles, but what you are gaining is significantly more ability to feel the ball and judge how hard you're hitting your shots, which for intermediate to beginner players is very important. In terms of power and pop, again, very quick story here. Probably one of the only other paddles I've hit this year that measures lower than the Blue Core in both of those statistics. So we're dealing with another low power, low pop, very control-oriented paddle in that regard. I haven't done full reviews on either of the last two paddles, the Maxima nor the Blue Core, but I have talked about both of them on my podcast This Week in Pickleball with Aaron, so I'll link those episodes above. Now, finally, we get to the enhanced Gen 4.5. And sidetrack again here, comment down below whether or not you agree that this paddle should be called Gen 4.5. Essentially, what they're introducing here is similar core to the True Foam, but from what I can tell, different density, different thickness, of course, as this one will be 16mm, and then very different way of going about the perforations in the foam. But to get to the important stuff, this paddle really feels like you tried to achieve a Gen 2 feel, but with Gen 4 technology. So the result is a paddle with a nice wide sweet spot, probably wider than the True Foam, but not quite the entire paddle face the way the Blue Core and the Maxima are. You also get decent dwell time, probably in league with the Maxima, so towards the bottom. And then finally, when it comes to your ability to judge ball power and accuracy, it is by far the best out of the entire lineup. And finally, to talk power and pop, I really thought the industry in terms of Gen 4s was going to fall into a pit after the True Foams of all low power, low pop, soft control oriented paddles, which I have been enjoying recently. But the Gen 4.5 actually surprised me a bit, coming with a paddle that is much more squarely in the all-court category, perhaps leaning control in both power and pop. So they feel significantly more powerful than a Maxima or Blue Core, but are still not on the same playing field as the True Foam 2. Great, so all of that is out of the way now. We move on to step 4, which is actually breaking in these paddles. I did have a small problem here and reached a bit of an impasse because there was no way that I was going to have time to main all 4 of these paddles for a couple of months. So after familiarizing myself with what these paddles commonly felt like, I did need to resort to my top secret break-in method. I did talk about needing to use this on my ripples in the most recent pod episode with Aaron, and I will discuss this method in a later Mythbusters episode, but all you need to know for now is that this method essentially accomplishes the most important part of break-in, which is the breaking of the resin or the glue that holds a lot of the internal paddle components together. Of course, while I don't want to quite show the method just yet, just to illustrate my point, breaking of resin between sheets typically isn't audible because it occurs the more and more ball strikes that you do. But using this method, you do actually actively hear the resin breaking through. So here are some audio clips of me using this method on these 4 paddles. Some of you probably winced away from your screen in pain hearing those sounds and probably assumed that I broke these paddles. But just to illustrate my point, here are those same paddles that I was using post break-in and post actively testing them. I am pressing on these as hard as I can, and you can clearly hear there is not even any notion at all of any cracking in those paddles. So they are perfectly still intact. All right, now we reach step 5, which is just recollecting thoughts and data to determine if any actual break-in occurred. To be straight up, there was only one paddle of the 4 which didn't have somewhat of a detectable difference in performance, and that paddle was the Maxima. Whether or not the fact that the 008 is the only one of the bunch that has just a pure block of foam as the core is a factor in this is definitely something to take into consideration. But regardless, I felt very little to no difference in ball feel nor power and pop with this paddle post using my method, which does again simulate weeks of break-in. So I can confidently say that the 008 Maxima and the 008s in general are most likely not paddles that would experience anything different in performance over time. Now I want to talk about the True Foam 2 next because it was also the only paddle that had one attribute be impacted negatively, which was the sweet spot size. The sweet spot size didn't decrease significantly, but what you do feel is much more dead areas in the edges of this paddle. Areas where before you wouldn't necessarily get clean ball strikes because they're outside the sweet spot area, but you could somewhat work the ball over the net. Versus now, if you do hit the paddle sort of in the outer inch or so, that ball falls completely dead on the face. But more interestingly almost, what you do lose in that what I'll call forgiveness as opposed to sweet spot size, you actually gain even more plushness, and you gain a significant amount of ability to feel the ball if you do hit the sweet spot area. My thought is the two may go in tandem because as you gain the ability to feel the ball and understand how much power you need to apply, you may also be experiencing the ability to feel how far the ball truly dwells into the face, and you really understand the fullest extent of that plushness. I also experienced a sound of the paddle that felt very Gen 3 hollow-esque, much more so than the initial play testing weeks, which was very interesting because along those similar lines of a Gen 3, you do also get more power out of the paddle. Is it anything wildly different like we experience with certain Gen 3s after they break in? No. But whereas before, where I would say its power put it in the more power-leaning all-court category, I would say its new power level puts it squarely into a power paddle. Talking next about the enhanced Gen 4.5, when we're talking ball feel, there was definitely a detectable difference, but it was not to the same degree as the True Foam. This paddle kind of did the opposite in terms of the sweet spot didn't feel significantly bigger, but you did feel the forgiveness go up a little bit. And I believe because the paddle already replicates your ability to feel the ball well as on a Gen 2 paddle, there wasn't a super large detectable difference there. So the main thing I noticed was not much change in sound, but definite increase in forgiveness of the sweet spot. But once again, similar to the True Foam, I did experience a noticeable increase in power on the 4.5. Now, it wasn't at the same level as the increase in the True Foam, but similar to before, whereas I would have previously placed the paddle into the all-court leaning control category, I would say its new level has placed it closer to a pure all-court paddle. And to round up the data gathering side, discussing the Diadem Blue Core 19mm Max, this was my biggest surprise of all. The Blue Core had nearly no detectable change in ball feel. Still not a significant ability to feel the ball, but very plush and very large sweet spot. Neither of these factors changed from my initial thoughts. But while the pop on the Blue Core remained relatively the same, similar to all the other paddles, which is why I haven't really discussed it, the power level increased significantly. Now, I approached this paddle the most unassumingly of the bunch because it is the largest core thickness at 19mm, so I was not expecting any real change in power level even if the paddle was to break in. But whereas before I would put this paddle purely in control, I would put this paddle all the way into all court after my experiment. With pure control paddles, you're not typically driving the ball too much unless you can generate a lot of your own power, because simply the risk to reward ratio is simply too large. But with the new Blue Core post experimentation, there was a significant increase in reward to plowing through the ball and being able to generate the new level of power that it could achieve. All that being said, though, I do think we have no choice but to take into account the fact that this is a tri-layer core with that layer of aramid between the foam, which could be contributing to such a significant jump in power. All right, so we've wrapped up the data gathering, we've undergone the experiment. I've made these charts here to detail my change in thought as the paddles play differently over time. And in the end, all we have left is the final step, which is to reach a conclusion. So the final answer to the question, do Gen 4 paddles break in? My answer is yes, with a small exception. I'm sure most of you can guess where I'm going with this exception, but I don't think it can be ignored that every paddle except the Maxima had perforations in the foam or an area where foam could loosen into. And that loosening of internal components is exactly what occurs during break-in and makes me so confident in saying that yes, these paddles do break in. But when you think back to the results, why was the Maxima the only one to not experience a true change in performance? And I think a big part of that is the solid foam core with none of those perforations for the foam to really loosen into. This experiment was so interesting and rewarding because we've all been led to believe that Gen 4 paddles will not break in. And now you begin to wonder, do Gen 2 or Gen 1 paddles break in as well? We all know Gen 3 paddles break in, and I think where we're at with that technology is you're dealing with foams and materials that are a lot softer and squishier and ergo cause break-in to happen faster and cause a significantly hotter progression in the power. So let me know down in the comments if you want to see me re-replicate this experiment on Gen 2 or Gen 1 paddles just for fun. But if you made it here to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching and for your support per usual. Make sure you like and subscribe as well. Check out any of the full reviews that I posted for some of these paddles, and go ahead and hang on tight for those blue core and enhanced Gen 4.5 reviews in the coming weeks. And with all of that said, I hope you all stay happy and healthy, and of course, out on the courts. Until the next one. Peace.